All right, everybody, you able to see the screen? Does that work? You see the PowerPoint, not me. Great. All right, I will try to maintain my floatiness that I've just learned about and my choreography that I've just picked up beneath the screen, so we'll see how this goes. Let's see, I want to get rid of that. So good morning. I hope your spring's off to a great start. It feels like we are simultaneously flying into summer, and yet every day has 20 extra things that we get to participate in and do, right? I'm hopeful that professional development workshops like these offer you practical advice that you're able to transfer into your own teaching immediately. At Capitol, I get to spend half my day chasing beautiful sounds in the studio, and then the rest of the day is spent chasing things like effective practice strategies and learning theories and helping students adjust to being in college and kind of pulling back the mystery of how to college so that students can find more success if they're struggling in that transition, or their social group has disappeared and now here they are with a brand new crowd of people and they have to go back to learning how to make friends as 18-year-olds. Our conservatory gets one associate dean line, and we made the commitment to use it on student success. So this work has really changed the way I operate as an applied voice instructor. It's helped me work with my students in a more holistic manner, so I'm not just working with the pieces that they've already got put together or the learners that already have life figured out. And I would argue that if I taught the way I was taught 25 years ago, I would be much less effective at teaching concepts than I am today. I think both in the academic arena here at Capitol and in the professional arena with emerging artists at Siegel Festival or my New York City studio. Today's learners demand, quite frankly, that we see them as individuals, appreciate what unique traits they bring to the table, and are not afraid to challenge our methodology or our pedagogy. So I want to start with something that's maybe a quick gut check, right? So try not to overthink as we go through it. But when you tell this generation of students to go practice, what is it that you think they translate that as, and what is it that you think they go do down in the practice room if they get there, right? And with today's session, I want to think about how engaged do you think they're utilizing their brains in order to practice the ways that you think they're going down in the practice room to do. Are these practice strategies requiring active cognitive engagement, or are they going down in the practice room and running their songs and repeating their songs over and over in order to, quote, learn? I would say that many of our students are not under-practicing. I would argue that many of them are under-thinking if they're down there in the practice room. They're practicing in ways that spend too much time on the music that they already know. In other words, they're down in the practice room being little performers. So remember, the goals of practice and the goals of performance are vastly different and should be kept different. How can we help students establish practice systems that force them to wrestle with more challenges or fire up more cognitive load and take more of the leadership of their own learning rather than us being the ones that are always handing that information to them? Because believe it or not, one day we're going to not be available to our students, and they're going to have to warm themselves up before a senior recital, or they're going to have to navigate their own way through graduate school auditions without you holding their hand at the other school. And God willing, they're going to have to make musical and expressive choices without our input or without our bias in their own professional arenas. And I think we owe it to their brains to be conditioned for that level of autonomy. So today I want to think of ways that we can help teach our students how to learn and not just how to sing beautifully. So the secret to learning, write this down, here it is, the big secret, right? The secret to learning, and I think the secret to voice sustainability, is that we don't necessarily need to be spending hours upon hours every day to make our voices better. I think at Capitol, I make all of the schedules, the daily schedules for all of the entering students when they first arrive, and believe me, these college students don't have space for extended practice blocks of hours upon hours because suddenly there's only 1 or 2 or 3 offerings of college algebra, or there's less offerings of music theory, so they're kind of bound to whatever schedule we give them. And we also know that short, repetitive bursts of learning helps our brain build stronger neural pathways than fewer extended cram sessions, right? So Dr. Molly Gabriel is the author that I'm utilizing for this presentation. Her text, Learn Faster, Perform Better. I highly recommend if you're looking for practice strategies for your students. Gabriel offers that if students are able to go into the practice room for 10 to 15 minutes of planned rehearsal with specific goals, and they choose the right practice strategy that actually helps their brain retain information, then they are helping the brain myelinate in new ways that breaks down old habits and forms new neural pathways, compared to a student who mindlessly may spend multiple hours in the practice room singing or repeating through their best sections of their pieces. So, are your students walking into the practice room with a plan already in place? Have they already identified their weakest spots in the music or the weakest spots of their own individualized technique? Encourage your students to start there rather than running the parts of their music that they already know how to do well, aka perform, right? We feel better when we're performing. It makes us have more confidence in ourselves as we're performing because those things feel automated, like the previous presentation was talking about, rather than something like a practice session that may feel clunkier and messier and we're down in the muck. Are your students able to self-assess in the practice room when you as the voice teacher aren't standing there in front of them giving them the feedback? Can they describe what's happening, why it's happening that way, and how to make improvements to those particular sounds? If they've had a particularly bright tonal week, do they know to choose more open vowels in their vocalizing to help balance out their tone this week? If they know they've had a bright week and so they've overly fixated on that and now they're singing overly dark, do they know to choose different vowels on their own to help swing them back the other way and help them find more tonal balance? So helping your students understand that having the right recipe card can help them find overall balanced sounds faster. That also helps them become more efficient by teaching them how to be their own teacher and make their own decisions. Let your students in on the decisions that we're making every day in the studio so that they're equipped to solve their own issues the few hours before that senior recital. Basically, help train your students to be learners rather than to be reactive like parrots. It doesn't take much cognitive load to be told what to do. It takes much more cognitive load to answer why are you trying this particular concept, or to have to describe how you would play with that idea when you wake up tomorrow making exactly the opposite sounds that you've gotten your voice to do today. I always think about it like if my students can't describe it to me, they likely can't improve it on their own when I'm not in the room with them. As we think about student interest in participating and thinking of revenue issues of what happens if they don't participate and they aren't interested, right? One of the greatest skills I think we can demand of our students is their curiosity. Researchers frequently discuss metacognition as thinking about one's thinking or thinking about your learning. And I'm seeing more of a need to get our students more curious about their instruments, their vocation, their repertoire, the music industry in general. Why did they choose this? They didn't have to choose this. It likely chose them in a way, but help them verbalize why were you curious about this in the first place, right? Encourage your students to be more curious about just how efficiently they could release that phrase so that they become more explorative rather than trying to check off a box of a to-do list item. Because unfortunately, the slow, sustained progression of learning how to use this instrument is not a to-do list item. And yes, in my 30s, I'm happy with my chest voice too. Now in my 40s, I love it even more, right? So that voice and that instrument is going to continue to adapt and change. And if our learners think that they're done with the information they learned in that second semester, we're in trouble later in the semester when they're not continuing to transfer that through in the long haul game. Unfortunately, we as teachers can't want that curiosity for our students more than they want it for themselves. And we can help them by setting goals that are specific and measurable, attainable. We set standards just outside of their zone of proximal learning, right? Giving them a piece of music that's too far from their current technique sets them up for exhaustion and disappointment. And giving them a piece that they already possess all the techniques that they need doesn't really challenge their learning or improve their technique. So repertoire selection really is an art form, and we should expect to be clunky at times. and not be afraid to fess up with your students and say, you know what, I thought that piece was going to help show us your XYZ, but now we're finding that that song isn't as useful as we really hoped it to be, so let's try something else, right? Many students who are used to passive learning struggle to self-initiate tasks down in the practice rooms. Think of one of your students that you might describe as being stuck, right? Maybe you're teaching the same lesson week after week, or maybe you're not getting to move on to a new song or feel like you're connecting or correcting the same mistakes you've worked on the last week. So when you start to feel like you're teaching the same things over and over again, what's your first thought about that student? What's your first thought about your own effectiveness as a teacher? And do you let yourself go down that path? I think many of us will start to question the student's motivation and might find ourselves offering generic advice like, you just need to practice more, right? Or you really aren't applying yourself. I'm going to challenge us today to shift away from questioning your student's motivation and instead focus on whether or not we've showed them how to create a system that meets their individualized learning needs. Many of our current students, I think, are lacking executive function skills that can make practice room planning more difficult, right? Executive function skills like prioritization, time management, leaning into working memory, and self-reflection that doesn't slide into the emotional extremes like things like avoidance and catastrophizing. How can we help teach these executive function skills alongside vocal technique and the perfect vowels so that students are better equipped to walk into a practice session, tackle challenges, fire up their brains, and utilize various practice strategies that can add variety and play and struggle and self-reflection as part of the expectation? How can we help them move from this idea of passive engagement to really active learning? I would argue that many of us were taught in the three-step teaching cycle, right? Teacher provides the directive, student performs, and then the teacher provides the feedback. And I think that harkens back hundreds of years and stems from master-pupil model that has recently met a lot of scrutiny for the imbalance of power in the room, right? I recently wrote about morphing that three-step teaching cycle into what I call the three-step learning model for the Buckeye Voice newsletter. Instead, we can think of things like students self-identify trouble spots, students suggest possible solutions that they get to try out, and then students self-assess the effectiveness of those attempts. So we get to just lie down and do nothing, right? No. So compare the two models. How are the students' brains working at different cognitive loads? Which model is encouraging more passive learning? Because I would guess that that model is likely going to lead to the teacher having to repeat the same instructions week after week instead of students forming new neural pathways in their minds. Overall, asking questions creates thinking opportunities or learning opportunities. And if we utilize open-ended questions, like many of us were taught during our retail days, we likely gather more helpful information or data from how our students are learning. Students have to wrestle with new information in ways that help the brain retain that information in the great flushing that takes place every night as we rest and get to go to sleep. Notice that the questions on this slide mirror the three-step learning sequence I talked about. This is not earth-shattering pedagogy, so sorry, but you didn't pay to come today anyway. This is a practice organization, so students get conditioned or primed to ask themselves these same questions down in the practice rooms. Help your singers put on their little scientist jackets and go problem solve, right? Again, we are firing up inquisition and curiosity. The more you condition their minds to answer questions in your weekly lessons in an inquisitive manner without fear of shame or judgment, the more we are conditioning their minds to improve their self-talk and problem solving when they're down in the practice rooms. Students hear our feedback not just cognitively, but often emotionally. When feedback frames errors as useful information, students feel safe to take more risks, which is essential for creative development. According to research in music pedagogy, effective feedback actively reframes mistakes as normal and helpful. It's part of learning, and today's learners especially, they have to hear that explicitly rather than us assuming that they understand that emotional concept implicitly. Students do not hear your feedback neutrally. Their nervous system first decides whether that feedback is a threat or an invitation to participate. So when students experience feedback as vague or global, things like, that wasn't good, or you're just not prepared, the brain often responds with either avoidance or hyperbole. Avoidance is often going to look like disengagement, awkward humor, or maybe a refusal to try, while hyperbole is going to look like shame topics like, I'm just terrible at this, or I'm never going to get this, anything that you're going to read in a Brene Brown vulnerability book. Neither response is about the student's level of motivation. Both are about the student's ability to self-regulate their emotions. So is it faster to just say the answer for our students? 100% in that moment. But when that phrase falters again in 20 minutes or next week or in the middle of their recital, I think it's worth evaluating if students are learning the concepts or are simply just trying to repeat what we're asking them to do in the moment without really retaining the how or the why. Remember, we are not just fixing notes as voice teachers. We are teaching elements like decision-making, inquisition, and self-reflection along the way. Dr. Gabriel discusses these red, yellow, and green zones in her book, Learn Faster, Perform Better. And she helps students prioritize their progress in their music by labeling musical phrases as red, yellow, or green zones. And she also has students walk into the lessons self-identifying their red and yellow zones and starts lessons at those particular phrases. She says this increases cognitive load and maximizes the lesson minutes on places in the music that need the most work, rather than starting at the phrases that the students already know how to perform. These red and yellow zones likely create more discomfort for the student, but as they start to develop strategies on how to improve them, then they're simultaneously devising practice room systems and strategies to continue working on those spots without you being in the room. I use this in my studio every day. It's thriving right now. Students aren't hiding their trouble spots from me. I break my weekly 50 minutes up into 2 25-minute sessions each week, so I don't have time for non-communicative students that can't come in and say, yeah, this is what's really difficult for me. We have to utilize our time in a quicker way than that. My students walk in ready to point to those zones, and we immediately get to work making improvements on their most challenging spots in their pieces. Efficiency and strategy speed up our effectiveness, and then students are able to march off towards the practice room twice a week from our lessons, primed with specific ways of addressing specific problems. When you take the time to write feedback on an assignment, or you take time to give verbal feedback in a lesson, have you ever felt like in those moments you're just screaming into the void and nothing is coming back to you? Yeah. Some students resist reading the feedback and instead fixate only on the score that you gave them on the assignment. And some students start singing over your verbal feedback in a lesson to try to get back to why they're paying you for lessons in the first place. Again, we can reframe these behaviors as signs of lacking executive function. Have we trained our students about how to receive feedback? I saw an interesting post this week online, and Andrea, I know, shared it on hers. Are we helping our students prepare for unwanted feedback after a performance or after a recital? Are you helping them prepare for unwarranted, cheap seat opinions, of which we all know there's plenty of in this industry, right? At the same time, have you conditioned their minds and spirits to be able to accept helpful feedback as data, rather than an emotional barrage of, you're never good enough, or why do you think you're doing this? At Seagull Festival, we do this as part of the emerging artist onboarding each summer, right? We ask questions like, how do you prefer to hear and accept feedback? Because those emerging artists are asked this individually at the start of each summer, so they know that it's going to be part of the experience. And over the course of the summer, they're going to get a variety of opinions, suggestions, and feedback. And likely, those moments are going to happen in front of other emerging artists, right? It's not a one-on-one conversation. It's a public learning environment. We can help our students, quote, stick to the facts, ma'am, by asking very clearly, what happened in measure 13? Rather than broad feedback like, you were flat in that song, we could ask, where in measure 13 did you feel pitch begin to sag? Notice that identifies what the issue is, it identifies where it happened, and yet still invites the student to be an active member of that conversation. And even better, notice how the feedback places the action back on the pitch where it belongs, rather than on the emotional psyche of the learner, right? Not you are flat or you were flat, but where did that pitch start to sag? How often are students reflecting at the end of your lessons? I've got an Alexa in my studio, and I frequently ask it to set a 22-minute timer when I have a 25-minute lesson. And so when it goes off, I ask my students, what went in today? And then students have free space to summarize key points from the ideas we shared together. It's a great way of seeing if the key points that I felt I really was driving home went in at all. It also opens me up to their vocabulary that they've translated my words as. So then I have priming cues that I can use at next week's lessons. That's actually their language rather than my own biased language. And then it opens the door for the last few seconds of transfer strategies that they can utilize down in the practice room. I do the same thing in group settings like voice area recitals. In the minutes after that week's performances, I ask our college majors, what did you see? What did you hear? And I ask them to stick to the facts and be specific. Avoid letting them slip into cheap feedback like, I really liked that song, or I really liked that performance. That's cheap, and I would argue that that kind of feedback is also cheap teaching, right? What did you like? What inspired you about that sound? What is something that you want to steal from that performer, right? What did you wish, based on that performance, that you want to go explore in your own engaged learning? Same thing in lessons. What did you like about your practice sessions this week, and what made you frustrated? What makes that red zone stay a red zone for this coming week as well, right? If we can help students accept and give and process feedback without encapsulating it so much with emotional weight, we might be able to lean into their curiosity a little bit more. I'm finding that this generation's willingness to sit in discomfort or to live in a little bit of struggle to be counterproductive to what it takes to be a singer. The TikTok generation and attention span is not really conducive to making meaningful technical advancements in your voice when it comes to something that takes slow, steady commitment. What do you think students process that frustration as, right? They get in the practice room, if they go, and they get down there and they start to try something and it's not going just as great as it was because now my teacher's not in front of me and I can't recreate and they start to get frustrated with themselves and they start to feed themselves those shameful messages, right? What do you think students translate frustration or discomfort as? I hope that we can help them realize that struggle is a signal of learning and struggle is a signal that learning is taking place in that moment. And if we can sit in that struggle a little bit longer, you've got the opportunity to make physical changes in your brain. And without physical changes in the brain, no learning is taking place. By avoiding discomfort and by avoiding the frustration, you are avoiding remyelinating neural pathways. And so suddenly we're constantly using the things that were our preferred way or our old way of teaching or singing without trying in new ideas. Remember, learning equals physical changes to the brain, and Gabriel presents many of those strategies to assist with these changes, and we'll talk about some of those coming up. For years, I thought I was helping students not get distracted by breaking repertoire into one piece at a time, right? I would kind of make an overall plan that I think, we're going to work 2 to 3 weeks on this piece. So cover things like basic musicianship elements, technical elements in week 1, shifting to more phrase shaping and intention characterization work in week 2, small memory checks throughout that process so that by the end of the 3rd lesson, we're ready for a big memory assessment, and then we get to move on to the new piece, right? That felt very systematic to me and organized. And I felt like if we could get through all the pieces like that, we could get there by juries without any sort of unnecessary stress. Well-intentioned, right? The result? Memory challenges, students who are bored in the practice room, right? And an overall low cognitive load because students were actually living in just one mindset or having to deal with one set of challenges, right? Challenges like one style, one language at a time, one overall tonal center at a time, right? And things like performance practice. So this is actually known as blocked practicing. And Gabriel's research points out that it's less effective for issues like memory recall and challenging and changing the brain. Blocked practicing creates a short-term fluency, but a weak long-term retention, especially under pressurized moments like juries or recitals, or getting up in front of your teacher. Blocked practicing boosts things like confidence and motivation because it feels really productive because you've got all the time in the world to just think about one thing at a time. But Gabriel points out that short-term performance does not equal long-term learning, and that students often mistake ease of learning for effectiveness. She suggests that interleaved practice sessions instead, where a student bounces between different types of challenges. Rather than working a piece left to right, isolate challenging phrases within a piece and have students work to master techniques required for those phrases. Then choose another phrase that varies the techniques, right? So maybe you're going to move from a lyrical legato phrase in one piece, and then you're going to move to one that's much more arpeggiated and contains wider leaps. Maybe you're going to spend time working a German phrase that requires softer, energized singing, and then you partner that with a phrase from musical theater where students have to come to the realization that belting does not have to be loud, it has to be acoustic, right? So rather than clearing all the obstacles for the student and giving them one thing to do at a time, you're actually asking the brain to be flexible, adaptive, and handle a variety of challenges. This gives the brain more tests and allows for the skills you work on in piece 1 to almost be forgotten while you're working on piece 2, so that when you go back to the first piece, your brain has to recall the challenges and the cures and the feedback. That recall is where we increase cognitive load and makes the brain work harder without as many repetitions or cues from us as the teacher. Interleaved practicing makes the brain work hard during practice sessions, and then that frees it to let go during performance. So we can be more at flow state rather than trying to micromanage or build our technique in the middle of the recital. Interleaving is not about random chaos. It really is still a systematic alteration of skills, excerpts, tempi, articulations, key centers, things like that. Blocked practice isn't bad. It just shouldn't be the only thing that we're asking our students to do in the practice room. It's particularly useful in introducing new music, but Gabriel suggests that we have to move away from it in a practice session so that your brain has time to almost forget the work that you did that day on the new piece. So a possible 60-minute session that blends both types of learning may look like 10 minutes of blocked practice where you introduce a new phrase or a new song, 30 minutes of interleaved rotation with different types of play. You go back to that first piece for 10-minute retrieval where you're having to rebuild because in that amount of time, your brain's almost let go of it and suddenly you have to build the Lego structure again. And then giving your singers 10 minutes at the end of that practice session to reflect on what was effective and where do they need to mark their zones before they come to see you again. Help your students remember that if it feels uncomfortable, if it feels harder in practice, it's actually going to end up working better for them in performance. Some examples of interleave strategies: serial practicing. So you are before a recital, you've got several pieces. Throughout all those pieces, you're going to pick 5 to 15 musical spots. Not the entire songs, but some phrases or half a page. Cycle through each one just like it's a performance. So this is not a stop and practice. This is, I'm going to practice some performance elements as you go. If you're happy with spot 1, put a check mark next to that spot, right? When you get through all 5 to 15 of those spots, cycle back to number 1 again. Do it again. If you're not happy this time, you have to erase the check mark. If you're happy on the second go, now you've got 2 check marks. And the goal is that by the end of your practice session, you've got 5 check marks for each of those trouble spots. So it's adding an element of play, it's a game, that kind of thing, so that students aren't getting bored and they're cycling through all of the moments that they are wanting to reinforce in a way that doesn't give them time. Of course, we all can sing better if we stop and take time to practice it and build it. But as we get close to the recital, we also need to be practicing the element of not stopping, right? And so how do we continue to manage oopsies when they're going to hit in a way that we can play with it so we're ready for that to actually happen in the recital as well. Another one she talks about is performing in random order. So divide your music into sections, assign each one a specific number, and then start drawing from a hat. And so for each one that you draw out, you perform that phrase or you perform that part of the song, no stopping, just like it's a concert. And then as you go through, you're organizing piles of those went really well today, or I need more time, right? And suddenly you have, after that practice session, a division of here's some green zones, here's some yellow and red zones. Playing with time, right? Set a timer to go off repeatedly every 5 minutes. Pick one trouble spot that you want to nail in performance that's been causing you some issues. Every time the timer goes off, first, you start by practicing something different than that trouble spot, right? And when that timer goes off, you immediately hop to the trouble spot and you do a quick run of that section. And then you move on, right? Every 5 minutes, you're coming back and you have to do it again. Again, you're giving yourself the chance to forget and have to rebuild some strategies when you go back. Time-constrained practice, she says it works well for brand new music. Pick 3 to 5 sections of a piece and set the timer to go off every 2 to 3 minutes, not more than 5, right, minutes total. Switch between sections every time that timer goes off, right? This is for a student who tends to just do endless repetitions. This is for the student who just gets down there and doesn't really have a plan or a strategy of how do I practice? I'm just overwhelmed that I have this stack of everything I'm trying to learn. And so what it's going to do is increase the student's focus because they know they only get 2 to 3 minutes to work on this particular spot. And at the end of it, they have to move on. Again, just playing with ideas to keep the minds constantly rotating. Add a little bit of play, add a little bit of game. Maybe this fires up some of their curiosity and makes it more fun. I won't spend much time on visualization or mental practice. Obviously, we just got great information on that. Remind your students that mental practice is a scientifically proven means of practicing, right? A few minutes of focused mental visualization where students can imagine what it feels like to sing or play a phrase, or how it feels to have that particular language and that text utilize the articulators, can challenge the brain's recall. It can help them anticipate problems without making a sound, right? And they can help practicing devising cures for mental mishaps. It's helpful for longevity, right? It can be done while we're also doing a variety of daily tasks, and it can overall just maximize the student's metacognition, even if students don't always have access to get into an open practice room. Gabriel's research shows that those students who took time to incorporate mental practice into their overall practice schedules had better recall strategies, less technical challenges when it came time to actually play their instrument, and thus the brain was freer in the middle of performance to deal with little mishaps rather than having to work so hard of actually crafting the technique or crafting the music in that moment. So again, these individuals are benefiting more from flow state. If students can imagine how it would feel to sing a passage with pianists, as Alex was talking about, then those pianists, what happened was their time of where to move their hands was shortened, right? Because they had visualized how that would feel to play. And so the hands knew, muscle memory knew where to go. Same thing in our text. If I feel like as I'm teaching a new French song to a student, if we can take the time to figure out the pathway from vowel to vowel or sound to sound, suddenly I'm not working so hard to create French. I'm getting to release and look for the economized moments of what actually stays the same between a schwa when you move to an when you move to an open o. We're economizing the actual muscle shifts that you get to do in that moment. Imagining how it would sound was actually associated with a better ability to anticipate what they had to play next, right? So that helped pianists remember the overall form of a piece so that they had more mental cues of how to work through a longer sonata, right? Because if you can think about what the chunks are, that gave you a better roadmap of handling memorization. If you imagined what it would actually look like, that in her research didn't actually have any impact at all on the learning, right? So focusing more on what it felt like, focusing more on what it sounded like, those were the elements that were changing, rather than focusing on what will I look like as I am doing this when you're working on the mental practice side. Are your students doing this intentionally, right? Are they trying to use those 10 minutes as they're running between class as an opportunity to get a little bit more learning in? Many of our students, I think, will be surprised that one of the best things we can do is take a break, right? As we challenge the brain and fill it with sticky notes all day long, the physical changes have to occur during moments of rest and recovery. It's why we have to eventually stop teaching the closer we get to the recital. And we have to trust that the student's preparation and working memory is going to be the things that guide them through the recital, with enough space left over to deal with any unwelcome blips or misses along the way. If you continue presenting new information all the way up into the recital warm-up, or from the faculty panel during Jerry's, you are overloading the circuits and the brain hasn't actually had time to process any of that information. You are a distraction at that moment, rather than thinking you're being a helpful teacher. Gabriel also talks about spacing, right? When we go in the practice room for a bit of time, our brains are likely to remember what we did at the beginning of a session and what we did at the end of that session, right? Regardless of how much time you actually spend in the room between the beginning and the end. So a 2-hour cram fest, in addition to tiring out a student's voice, leaves them with 2 cognitive moments that they're likely to hold on to that night. Now, if the same student would go in the practice room for repetitive shorter sessions, so let's say 4 half-hour blocks, they finish their day with 8 cognitive memory moments, rather than just those 2 if they had gone in for the cram session. It's the same strategy why I try to break those lessons into 2 shorter ones each week, right? My hope is that separating the technique and the repertoire lessons, students are more likely to remember 4 periods of time with me rather than just the 2 if I taught continuously for 50 minutes. More practice isn't always better. She argues that better spaced practice can be better. Great. Remember that asking questions is building your students' independence. If one of our goals is building decision-making skills, force your students to make small, low-stakes decisions frequently. The payoff? Your students will save hundreds of dollars per hour in the professional arena if they're equipped with pedagogical knowledge of how to self-assess and diagnose issues and play with a problem in a variety of ways so that they can free their mechanism on any given day. While I love my time with my artists, there also comes a time when I have to release them to the big bad music industry. And hopefully they leave our time together with a toolkit that's primed for a variety of stressors and feedback and situations, so they've upped their autonomy. Gabriel says that the one-on-one studio is a great place to enhance executive function skills, things like goal setting, planning, monitoring, and adaptation, and she recommends several tools. She says utilize a practice journal, right? Write goals, problems, and their solutions. Have your students write a list of things that you say, right? Have them write a list of what to work on in the next practice session. Again, not earth-shattering, common knowledge. Are you asking your students to keep that effectively and consistently? Scheduling, don't practice more than 5 hours a day. This is the moment in the room in the live offering that people would have chuckled, ha 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 ha, right? What are we, a pianist, right? Anyway, take at least a 5-minute break every 25 to 30 minutes of engaged learning. Give that brain a chance to stop, put a sticky note on that, hold it so that at nighttime, you've got a better shot of holding on to that in the great flush. Take at least a 90-minute break every 60 to 90 minutes of engaged learning. She says for focus, use a timer. This works great for students of all sort of neurodivergence attitudes as well. Give yourself a short amount of time to work on something. Set a timer every 5 to 10 minutes, and when it goes off, say out loud, what exactly am I working on? What exactly am I wanting to improve? How am I trying it? What strategy am I really using? So that vocabulary of practice language becomes more and more referenced to them, and that becomes more habitual. For motivation, unfortunately, again, we can't want students to reach their goals more than they want to do it as the learner. Research shows that students doing that to please other people like parents or teachers are more likely to fail in terms of long-term commitment. The onus of learning has to fall back on the shoulders of the learner. Teachers and friends, we can help cheer them on and direct them towards more effective strategies and systems, like when they're falling off the horse. But the overall motivation to be better has to come from within the learner and not be a result of some external prize situation or stickers or anything like that. Overall, to put it all together, Gabriel suggests interleaving the material, so we're hopping around in different strategies, creating many moments of practicing retrieval or memory recall without having them be able to look at the score. That moment of discomfort of, oh my God, I don't know this, but they have to build it and remember even 3 notes in a row, those 3 notes are now ingrained in the brain in a way that they wouldn't be had they just got to be on the iPad and read it. Increase more spaced sessions, right? More opportunities to almost forget information rather than totally re-teaching material every week. Increase intentional reflection moments, both verbally and through written work, and breaking larger pieces down into accessible chunks. Fire up simple opportunities for question and answers with your students so that if they're currently in a state of passive learning or passive engagement, they have to arrive with specific trouble spots and summarize verbally and write in the next 3 steps in their scores to get out of their lessons, right? Elementary teachers, middle school, this is your exit ticket, right? Kind of approach to teaching. Setting up a structure primes their brain to be ready to deal with you in bolder ways than waiting to be told what to do, when to do it, and why it should feel important to them. That's not really our job, right? They should want it to feel important for them themselves. If we only teach singing, I think students will certainly improve in our studios and improve in the room, right? But if we simultaneously teach singing and teach learning, I think we set them up for the ability to continuously improve as that instrument starts to change as they get older, or they may or may not stay in this world of music, but that inquisitive nature is part of their human experience, and hopefully they get to take that when they aren't standing in front of us anymore. Finally, as always, am I going to get something for free? If you have your camera phones, check the QR code. That goes through several of Gabriel's interleaved practice strategies and kind of talks about different ways that you can play with them. I've given you both the macro and micro level of maybe a practice room sheet for 1 week that kind of summarizes all these goals. And then how does that look over 14-week semester? How can I kind of broaden that out so that goal setting continues to grow as you go along? And then some basic slides that will summarize more concepts from the today. That's what I've got.